Welcome, listeners. This is Sebastian Nothwell here today talking with R.K. Ashwick,
Hi.
Noah Hawthorne,
Hello.
S. O'Callahan,
Hi.
and Sarah Wallace.
Hello.
All about writing series versus standalone. And here we are defining a series as 2 or more books in the same story versus a standalone, which is one and done. You get these guys for this story, and then we're out. Goodbye. Now, who here has written series and who here has written standalones?
I have written only series thus far.
I have written series and I have one standalone.
Well, I guess by that definition, I have not written any standalones, even though I often feel like my fellow books feel like that as a duology, but I guess not. So I also write series.
And I also currently only write series. Although I kind of do interconnected standalones, but we can delve into those nuances.
Now, of the 2 options, which do you find you prefer?
What a great question. I feel like because I only write series, I should say that I prefer writing series, and tell me if you guys agree with this or disagree. I find it kind of hard to stick with a series and not just chase the shiny new thing. And so I greatly admire people who can write, 7 books with the same characters in the same world because I don't think I could do it. So I am very tempted to try a standalone or something like the Metal and Men series where you're following different characters for each book, and so there is still kind of a shift. But yeah, so I don't know. I don't think I can definitively say I prefer a series until I give standalones a fair shake.
I think for me, I tend to think in terms of series. So even like when Shannon and I were drafting Breeze Bells and Bridegrooms, we didn't know that it was going to be a series. I kept pitching for it to be a series, and Shannon was very chill about it. Like, let's find out where it goes. But I was like, this character could have their own book, and this character could have their own book, and oh, maybe these 2 characters get together. And Shannon was like, let's see where it goes.
Yeah, at that point, I was like, let's just write one book first and see, because that was our first time writing together, so I had written my duology, and then this was, and I knew Sarah's books were all connected and expanding on and on into the future, and I'm just like, okay, well, hopefully this goes fine first, and then we can kind of talk about what comes after. And ultimately, I think because they were pitching that the whole time, we finished Breeze Spells. There was like a 2-week period of time where we just were like, okay, let's recover. And then I immediately was like, okay, so about book 2.
Now we can talk about it.
Right, exactly.
Right, exactly.
So I tend to always think in terms of series, even though I like the idea of standalones in terms of like the shiny new object.
Mhm.
But I'm always thinking in series terms, I think.
Yeah, for me, my first series was 6 books long. There was 3 novels and 3 novellas, which I really like doing side novellas and exploring side characters that don't really get the main spotlight in the novels. Then I went to Phantom and Rook, which originally was going to be a standalone. But again, there was just so many characters that I loved that I wanted to continue. So that's when I did the interconnected standalone. So we follow, we meet characters in book 1, and they're going to be in book 2. And then once you meet in book 2, we're going to be in book 3 kind of a thing, which I love, but it's also a lot to keep track. I have to make this big spreadsheet of who goes where, who's introduced when. I have a timeline. It's such a deal. So when I did the Rebel Foxes, my standalone, it was really nice and also weird to wrap it up. It's like that feeling of like, I know I'm forgetting something. But a lot of standalones that I like have kind of almost an open-ended, like the ending can kind of be what you want it to be or leave it up to the reader's interpretation. So that's kind of how I went about with mine. So it felt good either way.
Nice.
6 books is so impressive.
Yeah.
It really is.
I don't remember much of those years. I don't blame you.
Oh, fever dream.
Yes, basically.
I've never written a series with different protagonists for each book. I've always done sequels of the same guys back again for another adventure, but the challenge I have with that is giving each book a satisfying conclusion without tying it up so neatly that there's nowhere for the story to go next or no room for these characters to grow.
Yeah, you have to like kind of balance their character arc. Like you don't want to rehash the same arc over and over, but then you also don't want everybody to be flat by the end.
Yeah, Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know how people do it for longer series.
But then conversely, the challenge with writing standalones, or I would imagine I haven't attempted it, but writing books with it's like the same shared world and the same like family or group of friends or coworkers or what have you with different protagonists each book. When I start a new standalone, I am always immediately frustrated by the problem of I don't know who the hell these guys are. I don't know what they're going to do or how they would react to any of this. I have to feel like I have to waste a lot of time working that out. Whereas, like, if I'm writing a sequel, it's like, oh, I know these guys. They're going to do this because this is the only thing they could possibly do because they're them.
Currently, I'm only doing the ones with series. Each book is focused on a different group or different couple of protagonists. So I think in terms of how my brain, like, I tend to always think in series. For myself, I tend to start with books with a character is usually where the story idea starts. Because my books are pretty character driven as a rule. So I think it works easily for me to do each book is focused on a different character because I can build on previous books still. So I can have previous characters show up and continue their character arc if needed. Because even when people find their happily ever after, they're still going to continue to grow and they're still going to continue to have different challenges. And so I like being able to explore that a little bit in sequels. But you also get like the fresh perspective with the brand new protagonist that you can focus on. And so I think that's how it works for me. I don't know if that made any sense because quite frankly, I lost myself halfway through. I'm so sorry.
No, I think it does make sense. I think it's a nice like middle ground between doing a standalone to chase the shiny and then doing a series to stick with the same thing because you're still in the same world and part of it is still familiar, but then you still get a fresh perspective from the new characters.
Exactly. And like what Sebastian was saying earlier about having to introduce everybody, that is a challenge when you're doing like interconnected standalones, which I'm sure Noah can also speak to, that it's a tricky balancing act of making sure that you give enough context and background for anybody who picks up book 4 first, but also you don't want all of your readers who've been with you from the beginning or a reader who picked up the series from book 1 and is like marathoning through to be like, oh my god, I know, would you please stop explaining this to me?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's a very tricky. And so I usually, when I'm doing alpha readers and beta readers for my later books, I try to always pick at least one beta reader who hasn't read the previous book, at least. Or possibly the whole series if this is their first book. But I try to pick somebody who's going to have a fresh perspective so that way they can say, like, I have no idea who this person is. You didn't explain them at all. Or like, oh no, it all made sense. Or for my next book, Spellmaster, putting on Cress, I had multiple people say, like, all of Jerry's friends blurred together. I have no idea who they are. So I had to focus on making sure they were introduced properly because I had kind of gone into it as if everyone knew who they were, and that wound up not working out, obviously. But it was good to know from like the beta reader perspective where I was failing in that.
I'm a little bit reminded of Animorphs and Babysitter's Club and how the second chapter of all those books was always like, if you're jumping in on book number 46, here's what you missed. Here are all my friends.
Here's Brittany's Mom Glee.
Like a cast of characters at the front.
I love that. I think for me with Phantom and Rook, it's such a big world and it's so multi-layered and there's so much lore and world building that's really only touched upon. I think that's what I like about continuing in this world. Is you can each layer you're kind of peeling back with each next book and you get to explore a little bit more. And that's what I like about it.
Agreed.
And I know Sebastian hates trying to figure out new characters, but I think that's part of the fun of like hopping over to new characters is trying to figure them out.
I don't hate it, but it always just kind of surprises me every time I start a new project.
New whip, who dis?
It's a challenge I really should expect by now, and yet.
Right, like you've written so many books at this point, but you get started and you're like, all right, what is happening here? I don't know any of you. This is confusing for me as well. But I agree. It's a lot when you first get started, but it's all part of the fun.
Truly.
In my first series, it was just multiple POV. So you had the same characters all throughout, but some were kind of maybe added. So that was also kind of different too. I don't know if anyone else has done that where it's not changing per se. Like you're still following the same people, but it's multiple, like kind of like a epic fantasy style or something like that.
I guess I'm kind of doing that with both series right now. For
Yeah.
Stray Spirit, that was just in Emery's POV. And then book 2 is in Emery and Cal's, and then book 3 is in Emery and Aspen's.
Oh, cool.
And then for Rival Most Vile, book 1 is Ambrose and Eli, book 2 is Ambrose, Eli, Dawn, and then book 3 is Ambrose, Eli, and then a character that you meet in book 2.
Ooh, that's exciting.
I like that. That's cool. So you still have that original characters you first met.
Yeah, like in book 2, like you're still with Ambrose and Eli because I can't possibly let those boys go. And I wanted to give Dawn a romance, and so then you experience her romance through her POV.
Aw.
That's fantastic. I sort of did that in the series that I never talk about that I wrote like 8 years ago. It's not that I'm not proud of the series. It's been a long time since I picked them up, so I barely remember them. But they were cozy mysteries, but also like cozy fantasy. It was like a 1920s fantasy world, and every story was an adaptation of a different fairy tale. And it was based around this one detective couple. And so each book was about the detective couple, but there was usually like a secondary character who also got the third point of view. And so that POV shifted with each book because they would go to a different mystery. And so one of the people in that mystery would also have a POV.
Can I just say that series sounds awesome and you should talk about it more?
Thank you. I was very proud of it at the time. It was prior to me realizing that I was queer. So it's queer in that I am queer. So even when I didn't know, it was still, sneaking in the corners. And I only published 2 books. I have like 3 or 4 drafts collecting dust, but they're still out there. The Carmichael Case book still exists, and you can still buy the first 2 books if you want to read them.
Everywhere starts somewhere. It's part of your journey. It's part of your backlist.
That's right.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
I learned that I am not a mystery writer. That's for sure.
Some of us start with several thousand words of Moby Dick fanfiction. But what I'm getting here as a theme is that it seems like more of us are writing series with a rotating cast, as it were.
Yeah, I would say so.
I would agree.
Is that the reader expectation of a romance series? Because it is something I also see a lot with other books and other authors in our genre. A series where it's a different couple every book, but it's all centered around like a specific location where everyone meets, or like they all have like a specific job, or they might even all be members of the same family and you meet like each one's spouse in each book. Does this sound familiar to anyone?
I want to say yes. I know I first saw it in like when people talked about small town romance. You'll kind of hop between different people in that town. But I don't know how recent of an expectation is. I don't know how niche that expectation is of just like the romance subgenre. I don't know if anybody else can speak to that.
With like historical, I think Bridgerton, prior to the TV show, I feel like that's a pretty common theme in historical romances where you follow like a family. And like you said, the small town romances that's pretty common in like contemporary. When it's a series, I feel like romance readers anticipate having a different couple in every book for the most part. For like contemporary romance, for sure, and for like Regency romance, I think as well.
I would agree. I've seen it both ways. I think the interconnected thing is probably more common, but I've also seen other ones where it follows the same couple too. And I think that's probably a little bit more common in fantasy. And in fantasy, I think you change locations more so, like country locations, you know what I mean? So maybe if it's like a cozy or urban fantasy, I think especially urban fantasy locations may be just like from a coffee shop to a bookstore kind of a thing.
I think you have something there with like, it does depend on the subgenre whether or not it makes sense to follow the same couple. Because, like, if it's a contemporary where they both have office jobs, the story, they get together, they're happy at the end of it. There's not really a whole lot to go on with it there.
Right.
But, like, if one's a wizard and one's an assassin and they have to solve a different magical mystery every book, like, there's something for them to do besides have a relationship. And then they can deepen their relationship along the way and still have a plot without having to kind of reset their relationship status and personalities at the beginning of each book.
Yeah.
Slides fella enchanted and fellow ever after across the table.
Yeah, I was gonna say my little historical fantasy where it starts, 1890s Ireland in a rural village, and that was all of book 1. And then book 2, they go on a horseback road trip to the coast where they see castles and the ocean, and so it definitely. I had my whole first book set in the one small village, and then the whole book 2, they are not there at all. So it was a completely different location. So I have to back that one for sure.
If your guys are stale, give them a little quest. See what happens.
Exactly. And it worked out so well for both of them.
That's what I did for Spirit Well too. I tossed them into a totally different city for book 2, and then I'm going to do the same in book 3.
Love it.
They don't get to settle down, not yet.
They have to give us a delightful series of fantasy travelogues first.
Yep.
Which I think that's the beauty of fantasy. in real life, I can take a road trip and then I have to go back home because I have a job and all this other stuff I have to get back to. But, you know, when one of the main characters is Fae and the other is human, I was able to have them just go and do the things that they needed to do. And it all works out beautifully. So it's the magic touch that I think helped make that not so much of just like, all right, Peter, you gotta, you know, you got stuff to do, dude. Let's go back home. It gives that extra little like, it's okay though, because it's all made up. They can do whatever they need to do. It's fine.
Yeah.
We don't have to wonder why so-and-so can suddenly take off weeks of work from his nondescript office job.
Exactly.
Where he does, quote-unquote, paperwork for precisely 8 hours a day.
Exactly.
I will say with Metal and Mend, it's kind of a hodgepodge series because book 2 does wind up with the same core characters. My editor called them the Half Moon Street Gang. But like it follows a brand new protagonist that you haven't met in book 1 at all. And then after that, the rest of the books follow a protagonist that you've met before. Book 2 started with an idea that I'd had for years and finally decided to write the idea. And as I was developing the idea in my head, I thought, oh, this other character could be that guy I had in The Letters to Half Moon Street, who's Charles's best friend. And so then I wound up blending this long-running story idea I had for like 10 years into my Metal and Mend world. So on the one hand, Metal and Mend is centered around the Hartford family, but on the other hand, it's also like kind of random characters that they meet along their way and create their little found family with. So it's a bit of a mix.
Yeah, you've got the same core cast, but you keep folding in new ones as the story continues.
Yeah, good way to put it.
It gets complex the more people you add. I think book 3 of Rival Most Vile, because you start with the entire cast of the street, and then they just keep collecting new friends like Pokemon.
Yeah.
By book 3, it's gonna be a mess. There's just gonna be too many characters. I'm gonna lose track.
That's what I've been like, who can I kick out? Who can we, you know?
Who needs to go on a vacation for a little bit?
Yeah, who's gonna go off?
You can't kill anyone off in Side Quest Row.
No one will die in
Can't
Side
do
Quest Row.
it.
We're just gonna have to deal with the people.
We didn't say that. We just said kick them out.
It's not my fault that they just keep adopting side characters.
You're gonna force one of them to pack up a little stick and bindle and wander off into the sunset looking morosely back at the town.
I guess it is my fault that they keep adopting side characters. I guess that's specifically my fault.
That's why we love them.
Yeah.
Now, from a business perspective, because we are all indie authors and we do have to think about this at some point, is it better to have a series or an equivalent number of standalones? Which do readers tend to gravitate towards in your estimation and experience?
I was going to ask you all something similar because I know the conventional wisdom is that series, it's going to sound crass, but series are more profitable because you can hook a reader and have them like read through a whole series. Whereas for standalones, I guess like each standalone has to hook them. But I don't know if that's true anymore.
I always thought that standalones made more money.
Oh, interesting.
And people don't like to read series until they're finished. So like they won't buy it, and then some people don't want to finish the series because no one's buying it, kind of a deal.
That makes sense. Yeah. I also feel like standalones are a little bit easier to market because if you're trying to market a book 2, it's like, well, I can really only viably, for interconnected book 2s, you can only viably market it to people who have read book 1. And so it's kind of hard to just throw out a log line and get new readers. Like you have to get them in through book 1 first, if that makes sense.
That does make sense, yeah.
It also makes it more challenging to find ARC readers because you have to get to a pool of people who have read book 1 and liked it enough to want book 2.
Yeah, especially if you don't want them jumping into the series in the middle.
Yeah. For both of my series, they're not necessarily ones that you can just read book 3 and get the gist. Like they're all genuinely connected.
Yeah.
That said, I did get a lovely review of Tales from Blackthorn Briar, which is a collection of short stories taking place after O King Holly King, where the reviewer said something to the tune of, I've never read a Sebastian Nothwell book before, but this is a great introduction. I'm just like, how do you know who any of these people are? I'm so sorry. This must have been so confusing for you. If I'd known that this was your first one, I would have given you book 1.
I mean, to be fair, my first Suzanne Clark, I read her collection of short stories before I read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell because it was way less intimidating. So I can imagine it being like a good entry point. If someone knows that they're reading a collection of short stories set in a magical world, they probably anticipate it being just random characters that they won't know who they are. So I can actually see it being a good entry point for a new reader.
Okay.
Yeah.
The other thing I have noticed is that releasing a sequel tends to boost sales of the first book.
Mm-hmm.
Because they see, oh, this is a sequel to whatever, and they're like, well, what's whatever about? So they go look at it, they pick it up, they read it, and if they like it, hey, there's a sequel.
Yes.
I guess like the long-term profitability for series is that once you have a finished series, if you're marketing the first book, ideally you then just get readership following through for at least part of it. And so, like, that backlist kind of does some of the work for you.
Yeah.
That said, that's a lot of work to put in to finish a series.
I mean, my book series is not finished yet, but I dropped the first book to free shortly after book 4 came out. And it has worked in my favor, again, partly because mine's interconnected standalones. So the series isn't complete, but it doesn't matter if the series is complete. It's still going to, each book theoretically reaches like a happy conclusion that the reader feels satisfied by the end of it. So it's okay that it's not complete, I hope. But with just the 4 books out with more on the way, I mostly plug book 1 a lot as the free book so that people go to that one as an entry point and then, read whichever books afterwards as they please. So you don't, if you're doing a longer series.
That is a good idea.
Thank you. It does help, and it's interesting because mine's interconnected standalones, because I can see which books, are selling more. And so book 2 is my highest seller in that series now. And book 4 is my second highest, which I find fascinating because I think it's because the main character in book 4 is introduced in book 1. So I think people read book 1 and they're like, oh, I like this character. Oh, he has his own book. Great. And then they just jump ahead. Or people go to the second book. So it's like 2 different paths. So book 3 is, gently gliding behind both of those.
Oh no, poor Pip.
I know, poor Pip.
He suffered enough.
I know. But it is interesting to see the trend of that books 2 and 4 do really well because of that. And I assume book 5, since similarly the main character in book 5 is also introduced in book 1, it'll be interesting to see where that one ranks as well. But yeah, that's my experience with it. It obviously will differ between different types of series, but you do have to market the series a lot still. In my case, my marketing is primarily with like promo sites rather than like social media. So I mostly plug the free book in promo sites, and then I don't have to do a whole lot of marketing for the rest of the series because I'm kind of depending on the read-through rate.
Yeah, you mentioned that in when you were talking about the free first in series episode.
Yes.
Which you can listen to right now by clicking over to Permafreeze with Sarah Wallace.
Thank you for putting in that plug.
How many books do you have in your series, Sarah?
So it's technically 8, but I'm pausing after 6 because I was experiencing, this is the downside of writing a long series, is I was getting a bit of burnout with both writing and promoting the series. So book 6 was written as an epilogue for a couple, and so it seemed like a really fitting place to pause where hopefully readers won't be like, hopefully they will want to know what happens next, but they won't be feeling irritated that they're being left high and dry or anything.
It's not like a cliffhanger.
Yeah, it's definitely not a cliffhanger. I hate cliffhangers. So I hope to never put one in my book because they stress me out as a reader. So yeah, it's 8 technically, but 6 for a while.
Yeah, I hear you. I'm gonna do, I can't remember, it's 8 or 9. I think it's 9.
Mhm.
And I had to push back the one I'm writing now to next year. I was gonna release it this year, but like I need a buffer.
Yeah.
So then I think it'll make it easier when releasing because then like I'll have one ready and like be quote unquote ahead of the game. So I think that's really important in writing series is to realize that I feel like after book 3, you're kind of like, I need a break.
Yes.
And just realize that you're going to need one and maybe have something else you can go back and forth on.
100%. Yeah, be wary of like the burnout. Something that I did inadvertently with Medlin Mend, and then Shannon and I did it a little bit more intentionally with our co-authored series, is with Medlin Mend, I wrote Letters to Half Moon Street, and then I was in like a hyperfixation mode, and I wrote the first 4 books in, 6 months or something. And then I started looking into publishing the first book. And so it worked out really nicely because then I was kind of ahead of schedule always. And last year when Shannon and I wrote Breed Spells, we wound up similarly just like beasting through writing all of the books together. And so now all the books are drafted. It's just a matter of polishing them and getting them ready for publication. So if that's something, if you're thinking about writing a series, that is a good approach if you're not in a rush, because it really helps with the anxiety of what happens next once you publish a book, because you kind of always have something kind of ready to go, or like mostly ready to go before it's time for the next one.
That's a really good point. And I feel like a middle ground could be like at least having the series planned or like outlined so that you have a sense of where you're going without having the full drafts. I think when I first started both of these series, I didn't have the series outlined enough. And so there was some stress in terms of like, oh, wait, crap, what happens in the next book? And I wish I had thought about that a little bit more before diving in. But I don't know. When I started writing Stray Spirit, I wasn't actually thinking about publishing. So I can't be too mad at myself for that.
That was me with my first series. I just wung it, and then I'm like, wow, I could have. There's a lot of things that could have connected and done a lot nicer here. So then when it's 11 a series, I was like, all right, this is gonna happen in this book. This is gonna happen in this book. You know, the finer details they can iron out later, but these are the major events. And just having that really did.
I guess one downside to writing series is that you can kind of write yourself into a corner a bit occasionally. It lends itself more to that than standalones do.
Mm-hmm.
Book 2 of Meddlin' Men was the hardest book I've ever written, but I had already written books 3 and 4 when I was working on revising book 2, and there was a part of me that wanted to completely scrap it and start over because I was having such a hard time finishing it, but I couldn't because I was too emotionally attached to book 3 and 4, so I was like, I have to have this book! This has to happen because I have to get to Albion Crest.
Yeah.
And so I was like stuck with book 2 the way it was, and so I made it work, but like it wound up being a stressful like month or two of revising it because I wasn't truly happy with it really, but I was kind of stuck with the plot.
That stuff does get really tricky. I really struggled with Spiritwell for most of the time, but I was like, no, I have to write this so that I can get to book 3, because book 3 is where it all like wraps up and stuff. Yeah, it's those middle books, man. They're really tough.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that is like the common wisdom about the middle part of a trilogy is just like, because it has to do such a good job at bridging between the end of book 1 and the beginning of book 3, like it's so rarely gets to be its own thing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I really pushed hard for my fellow books to just be a duology. I pushed myself to do that because, like, I finished the first book and I was like, all right, I'm not done yet. But I knew as I was writing the second one that I'm like, I can't do a third one. Like, it has to finish here. Like, and so, you know, I kept that in mind the whole way because I'm like, you know, and then I finished that one. I'm like, you know, I do love these characters and I'm going to miss writing them. And, you know, of course, there's like that little whisper in the back of your mind. It's like, keep going. There's more you could say. But I knew solidly that I was like, no, I want this to be 2 books because I feel like I was very happy with where the first one ended. And then the second one, I was like, I can wrap everything up in this. I do not need to continue, you know, as much as I would have liked to it sometimes, but it's just like, nope, I gotta be firm with myself. And so I'm very happy with them being just the 2. And I feel like I said everything I needed to say. And, you know, now 2 years later, I'm definitely like, yeah, I'm glad I didn't stretch this out because I accomplished my goal with everything I wanted to put into both of them. And it can be slippery slope, you know, that the more that I write, the more I'm like, oh man, it's hard to let go of this world. But I think it's also, you know, one of those things where it's like, I knew that I wanted to wrap it up. I knew that I wanted it to be what it was. And so I held strong to that decision. And I'm glad that I did. You know, if you are going to start writing, maybe try to have that in mind when you go into it, just like, do I want to stretch this? Or do I want to just have, you know, it could be 1 book, 2 books, 3 books, 10 books, whatever. But, you know, the more that I write, the more that I feel like it's kind of nice to go into it with a little bit of a plan of like, okay, how much time do I see myself dedicating to this? And I think that almost helps with the slump parts of just like, well, is this the slump in the middle? Is this the slump, you know, where am I at with this? So I don't know. The more that I write, I feel like the more that it's important to me to kind of know that from the beginning of like, how long is this going to go?
That's a really good point. I feel like I should try a duology. I feel like, because, you know, by now, like I have books 3 left for both series,
Mhm.
but, like, I'm so ready to go to the shiny new thing.
Right.
So, I feel like I should try the duology method.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Those were my first 2 books, but I don't feel that I had that, "Oh, I gotta bridge the gap." I was really happy with book 1, and then book 2 wrapped everything up so nicely, and then I could move on to the next story. And, I had actually a standalone that I had started when Sarah and I started writing Breeze Spells together, and it's still sitting there in my drafts, and I know that it's a standalone. I never get back to it when I get back to
When
it.
you get back to it.
But yeah, that's all right. Someday. But yeah, I really enjoyed the duology because it felt like both books ended up being equally as strong as the other. And so I feel like that I didn't experience that, like, okay, well, I got to get through this one because I have book 3 to, wrap up everything. It's like it felt strong writing the whole thing. And I think based on the feedback I've gotten on it, I think readers see that. They often say that, the second book, they enjoy it more, they enjoy reading it for that reason. I think that from the beginning of writing it, I knew that it was the end as well. And I think it shows because it comes across, I guess, to readers as a very strong conclusion throughout, which I'm pretty proud of. So
Nice.
You should be.
Amazing. And as a reader, I love duologies. I have a harder time with like novellas and standalones because I like get attached
Yes.
and I have a hard time letting go.
right. Yeah.
So I like to have like never more than one book, but I would like to write a duology someday. What I'm writing now is another standalone, and that's kind of going into it. I knew it was going to be a standalone, so it's probably going to be a hefty book, but where do I put, where do you put the emphasis on things? So if you go into it knowing that it's going to be wordy, you want the words to matter and have intention behind them. So that's kind of been in the back of my mind as I write. Whereas if you're writing a series, you can kind of maybe stretch things out more, and I don't know.
Yeah.
If you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I do, because I think with series,
Mhm.
readers know going into it that it's going to be a long haul. So they're kind of strapping in for a longer story. So I feel like with series, readers are a little more forgiving of a longer project.
Right.
Now, Sebastian, you have written standalone, multiple ones. So what is your perspective when it comes to writing standalones? Like, what are the pros and cons of that? Because you have experienced that more than anyone else in this chat.
Standalones are easier to market because, like we said earlier, you don't have to convince people to read a whole other book first before they even think about approaching the second one or the third one or the fourth one. It can sometimes be easier to convince readers to give them a chance because, like you all said, a lot of readers won't start series unless they're finished. Or a lot of readers see a long series of books and they think, I do not have the time or energy to get invested in that right now. I need a one and done. I need to get in and get out. And then I trap them in a 700-word book anyway, so haha. And then I would say the challenge is readers do get very attached to a particular set of characters, and when they want more of just those characters, they might not necessarily be willing to give different protagonists and different stories a chance, even if it's all by the same author. And you may, years and years and years down the line, continue to get irate emails from readers who really want to know why you're writing all these other books instead of their favorite guys. It's just like, well, I too love my favorite guys, but there's only so many ways I can injure this man. Like, it's starting to get a little... It's starting to break the suspension of disbelief for this one guy to be this unfortunate for so long.
That's when you turn to fan fiction.
Right.
Yeah.
Get on AO3, I can't stop you.
Yeah. Like I said before, like I get really attached to characters, but I didn't feel sad when Firenzo was over. Like it was long enough that I felt satisfied. You know what I mean? It was a standalone, but it was long and chunky and a lot happened and there was good resolution, and the ending I feel like also was long enough that I was able to kind of say goodbye.
Would now be a bad time to say I deliberately seeded Firenze with several sequel hooks.
Maybe.
There's definitely some that you could have went, but it's like good either way. Like you can leave it as it is, or you can go on, and I like that.
Thank you.
I saw something the other day where it's like leave stuff open-ended enough for fan fiction people to be able to like take their interpretation and do with it.
Oh, it's amazing.
Give the people what they want.
Exactly. I think, Sebastian, you did a really cool thing with your O King, Holly King books because you have a novel and then the sequel is like a set of short stories. So it's this really nice way to give readers like a little bit more of the story and the world and the characters without necessarily doing an entire other novel right away if you don't want to. So that's like another kind of compromise, I guess, between a standalone and a series.
A nice way to like strike a balance between the two.
Yeah. Yeah, nice.
That said, I am a little jealous at the way of how every sequel in a series pushes the whole series back to the front page of whichever book-selling site you're using.
Yeah, that's true.
Whereas, like, once I release a standalone, within about 3 months, no one's really interested.
That's true. Yeah, the legs aren't as long.
Our rapid release episode, sometime in the future.
Oh, don't do it. Bad for your health.
Are any of us rapid release authors?
I was gonna say, it couldn't be me.
Bad for your health. It was me and it destroyed me. I don't do that anymore.
Oh no.
I don't know. I guess what do we consider rapid release? You'll find out soon.
Someday.
I think that could just be a whole conversation in itself.
Yeah.
Well, until then, if anyone listening has been intrigued at the thought of all the series we have discussed and would like to find out more about them, where can they do so?
For me, you can find me on Instagram and TikTok at rkashwickbooks, and I've got a website, rkashwick.com, and my books are available wide.
You can find mine on Instagram, TikTok, Tumblr, all the good places at Neshama Publishing. It's Neshama Publishing.
Best way to find me is on Instagram. That will take you wherever you need to go at S.O. Callahan.
And I am on Instagram at sarah.wallace.writer, and I also have a website, sarahwallacewriter.com. You can find me at both those places.
And you can find whatever the hell I'm doing at any time at sebastiannothwell.com. Well, thank you all for learning, sharing, growing together with me on this podcast episode today.
Thank you. This was
It
fun.
was a great time.
Are we on PBS? Are we supported by viewers like you?
Thank you.
I mean, I certainly feel supported by our listeners.
Mhm.
What letter is this episode brought to you by?
Letter
for
S for
series.
series?
Yes.
Yeah,
I know
right.
my alphabet.
And the number is however many books we plan to write in our respective series.
Too many. Not enough.
So many.
And I'm excited to have you back for another roundtable soon.